Thank you, everyone. So this is sort of what I do for my research, in that it is somewhat related to manga, but it's also sort of just an excuse for me to talk about some of the shows and series that I've really liked, since I have had an interest in the topic for a while, which is, what did I call it? A space for the imagination, tales and tropes in manga, anime, and pop culture. So I was asked by the Institute people, Kate and Rachel, who is not here this week, to talk about some contemporary pop culture and the way these folktales, some of the ones we've been talking about this week, can be found in contemporary pop culture in Japan. And when I gave Rachel the draft of my lecture, she's like, "This is the most historical of all of them." And I'm like, that's really funny, because this is not really a historical topic. But so I'm going to have some sort of background historical information, and then the second half is going to be essentially attempts to sort of illustrate the breadth of the ways in which these things can be found. So the soundtrack is, by way of illustration of a later point, a band from Portland, Oregon called the Decemberists. You may have heard of them, or their lead singer, Colin Malloy. He wrote a children's book recently. Their second to most recent album was called The Crane Wife. And there's 2 songs on the album that are explicitly retelling the fairy tale of the Crane Wife, which we talked about this week. So this is one of them. There's sort of the the happy half of the story, and then there's the sad half of the story after she leaves him. And the photo is really cool. I found it on Google. People may remember yesterday Carl mentioning Kodama in the Studio Ghibli movie Princess Mononoke, Mononoke Hime. That's graffiti of the Kodama from Mononoke Hime on a wall in Japan.
Banksy is the artist?
No, it's just a dude, a person. No attribution, but in Japan.
Oh, in Japan.
Yeah, Banksy's different. So, and the Kodama actually are a really great illustration of the way in which, hush Colin, Ghibli works, which is to sort of take these old elements and put their own sort of very distinctive spin on them. So like, when you say Kodama now, or if you see something like this, people know immediately what they are. Whether they know what they looked like before that is another question. Okay. Hush, Colin. Okay. So one of the things we've sort of danced around talking about, but haven't necessarily addressed explicitly, is what the work that fairy tales do is, and why they're still so popular, not just in Japan, but also, of course, in the United States and other countries around the world. So this is something that I have wondered too, and this part of the lecture is actually drawing on a talk or a panel I was on 2 years ago in Vail, Colorado, at a conference about young adult literature called Sirens. So thank you, Sirens, for giving me the excuse to look into this. So one of the most well-known fairy tale scholars, Maria Tatar, suggests that fairy tales must be addressing issues that have a significant social function, and that fairy tales are part of an effort on the part of both women and men to develop maps for coping with personal anxieties, family conflicts, social frictions, and the myriad frustrations of everyday life. So in other words, as we have said before explicitly, you know, fairy tales were part of the folk culture of their day, and that they continue to be told and retold seems to indicate that their stories still have relevant meaning for contemporary society. Okay, so I wanted to highlight a little bit of the history of folk tales, fairy tales, and the sort of weird creatures that inhabit them in, oh, my fancy remote's not working. In Japan, as well as in sort of Europe and America. So when we say fairy tales today, especially in sort of mainstream US culture, we're most likely to think probably of Disney movies, who are, of course, really famous for their retellings of various fairy tales, or the Brothers Grimm, or both. And when we say folk tales, which are loosely distinguished from fairy tales, we think of Paul Bunyan or Coyote in particular, or other sort of more regionally familiar figures, depending on where we're from. So here's the Brothers Grimm, who are definitely the most famous of the 19th century folktale collectors. They weren't the only ones who were doing the same sort of work, though, which was part of this quest to establish, via fairy tales, a country's pure national literature and character, and that they could be found in fairy tales in this sort of rural, uneducated, unthinking folk culture. And this was part of, as nationalism gained more and more ground in culture and society in Europe in the 19th century. Many countries had similar people doing this. So you'll find the Grimms insisting, and this is the frontispiece from the original, I think 1817 edition of their fairy tale collection. You'll find them insisting that a particular fairy tale shows, the essence of the German national character, even though it's a fairy tale type that is common throughout the world, and can be found, not only throughout Europe, but also in Asia. Which is something that later scholars have sought to recognize. So another thing I think is sort of interesting to point out is that the Grimms, of course, literally brothers, were obviously male, and so the people who took these fairy tales out of the countryside were, by and large, male academics. And so they created this and many of the people who told them these stories in the countryside were, old women. So this is Mother Goose tales, for example, in English, another example. So these male academics are creating this image of the feminine, rural, sort of traditional culture that provides this sort of base against which to measure them. Very explicitly sort of characterizes masculine, urban, modern culture of the cities. Everybody wanted to be as modern as possible in this day and age. And Germany, in many ways, was the sort of most modern country. So it doesn't seem surprising that the Brothers Grimm would be the most famous. And so part of what happened as a result of this is that fairy tales, are sort of derogated, spurned as feminine, domestic. Marina Warner, who's another famous fairy tale scholar, she says, as a derogatory term, fairy tale implies fantasy, escapism, invention, and the unreliable constellations of romance. So Chris, in his lecture on Tuesday, talked some about Japan's attempts to modernize after 1868, and the Meiji oligarchs who took power after the Meiji Restoration were very conscious of the fact that if they didn't become modern enough and Western enough fast enough, they were more than likely to wind up like China, or other countries in Asia, either a semi-formal colony or an actual just colony outright. So they wanted to be players in the game rather than prizes. And they were, in fact, wildly successful in modernizing. And then they, in turn, went on to colonize other people, both externally in the rest of Asia, and then also the drive to modernize is often figured as in terms of colonizing the countryside in Japan. So you'll see a lot of scholars arguing that conditions in the countryside essentially reflect the same sort of conditions for people in the colonies. Excuse me. So this next section of the talk draws a lot on Michael Dillon Foster's book, Pandemonium and Parade, Japanese Monsters and the Culture of Yokai. They have it in the gift shop if you're interested in some of what I'm saying here. He's really good. The article I passed out in advance, which if you didn't get it, there's still a few extra copies floating around. That's also by him. It focuses more explicitly on one particular author. So the book is about the history of yokai, which literally means sort of weird creature. The supernatural beings, so kitsune, foxes, tanuki, the raccoon dogs, the inexplicable, the things that are mysterious, weird in Japan. It starts in the Edo period and it goes to about the 1980s. So one of the things he documents is how, starting in the Meiji period, folklore enthusiasts, such as the American Lafcadio Hearn, began collecting and publishing Japanese folk tales. Hearn was working in English. He could speak Japanese, but not. He was not native to Japan, obviously. There's a new book out that characterizes him as a Gilded Age misfit, which I think is a good characterization. That's the cover for one of his fairy tale collections. I think many of which are available on Google Books. So Hearn was working in English. The most famous scholar to work in Japanese was Yanagita Kunio. That's him on the left, and on the right is a very manga-style cover for his most famous book, obviously not the original cover, Tono Monogatari, which is usually translated as Legends of Tono, which is this rural country in the northeast part of Japan. So the Tohoku earthquake, Tono is in the same region, Tohoku, which means northeast, and it's traditionally sort of stereotypically very rural, very sort of quote-unquote backward, a little bit like Appalachia often is thought of in the United States. So Yanagita went out and talked to people and collected folk tales, and today he's recognized as the founder of Minzoku Gaku, which is the study of native Japanese customs. One of the things that Foster emphasizes, though, about Yanagita and many of the people who came after him, for them, the traditions and the stories they were documenting weren't any longer living, breathing entities, but instead they were sort of these artifacts from a past that was already vanishing. If you think of a tide going out and leaving behind rocks and shells on the shore, that was sort of the way they thought of things, but the tide was never going to come back in. So Foster sort of summarizes this when he says, the tanuki, which is here represents the mysterious, the weird, the folk culture. So the tanuki can be studied by people like Yanagita only after the train has killed it. And in fact, in the Meiji period, tanuki messing with trains and or being killed by trains is a pretty common folk trope. So the presence of these elements from the folklore and the stories of modern Japanese writers, a couple of which Foster reviews, have a similar purpose, which is to point out that only when people found themselves, quote, in a modern landscape seemingly devoid of yokai did they seek out the yokai that had infested the Tokugawa period. And in fact, one of the things I think that comes out pretty well from Foster's book is the fact that Japan isn't much different from other modern industrializing nations of the period in any of this. So there's the quest for the authentic primordial national self, and there's also the draining of mystery from the landscape by, the onslaught of modernity. And so in the book, Foster talks about this turn-of-the-century craze, a divination game that was known as Kokkuri-san, which acted much like a Ouija board. It was based on a Ouija board explicitly, and other attempts to define yokai and other weird phenomena scientifically. Which are very comparable to other sort of well-known things in Euro-American society at the time. These are the photos, two of the photos of the so-called Cottingley fairies from 1917, which purported to show either actual fairies interacting with these two girls who were the creators of the photos, or that the fairies in the images are sort of visualizations of their thoughts. There was a good deal of skepticism at the time, but there were also a good deal of people who thought that these were in fact authentic. And spiritualism and Harry Houdini and his well-known skepticism about spiritualism, mediums, and such were also huge in the United States and Britain at the time. So that's a poster from one of Houdini's debunking shows on the left. Top right, original Ouija board, and then bottom right is a group of people in Japan playing Kokkuri-san.
All of this, the European stuff, is closely linked, at least what I read, to the World War and the desolation and the hopeful return of this. There's a lot about the chaos society was in. So what was spurring it in Japan?
It starts in the States and Britain. It starts well before that, like starting in like the 1850s are sort of the earliest people claiming to be mediums. It certainly gets more popular later on. Arthur Conan Doyle, for instance, starting in like the 1890s, was a big devotee. Several Nobel Prize winners in the early 1900s get into it as well. So the World War sort of gave it a push, but like it wasn't the start by any means. Yeah, Japan's experience of the war is very different. Essentially, for them, it's a cash crop.
The Western world's enthusiasm, or was it naturally occurring in Japan?
So I wouldn't say mimicking. I think the fact that we see similar things in both sort of the States, the UK, and Japan speaks to similar conditions in society in all those countries. So you have sort of the continuing ascendance of science. I think in some ways you could actually look at the Snopes trials in the States, which happened around this time, as sort of the same conflict between these sort of older paradigms of religious understanding versus the new paradigm of science. So I think, the fact that we see these similar developments at similar times is sort of an expression of the fact that modernity is happening equally in all places. Yeah.
The handouts, we didn't get any.
They were passed out yesterday, and we have extras. So
Oh, okay.
So yeah, and there's definitely a few extra copies floating around, so we can get them afterward. Okay. Any other questions, since this was in fact a spot that I designated for questions?
It looks like this. Did you get it yesterday? Oh, okay.
We can photocopy.
Yeah.
We have more, it's just a series of readings, so it's to inform the talk, so engaging in the talk doesn't require the current, correct?
Definitely not. It's supplemental.
Oh,
Is it the one from JSTOR?
Yeah.
Is what you referred to Foster, and he was at the University of Michigan. Did you work with him, or did you just, I don't know?
I've read his book, and I have a friend who works with him in Indiana.
And he is so that was his interest. It was working in the.
Yeah, this was his dissertation, the history of yokai and yokai culture. Yeah.
So at this time period, what was the predominant religion in Japan, or was it more non-religious?
So religion is one of the categories that is sort of difficult to talk about. We have an idea of what we mean by religion that doesn't necessarily match Japan's idea about it very well. But at this point, the Meiji Constitution guaranteed religious freedom, but everybody was also compelled to participate in state Shinto ceremonies. So depending on sort of personal choice and background, most people are Buddhist and affiliated with a Buddhist temple. They may or may not be into state Shinto. Basically, almost everyone in Japan still today sort of goes to Shinto shrines and partakes in Shinto practices there as a normal part. And there's also a small but growing minority of Christians.
Is there mysticism in that? In Shintoism, is there like a mystical aspect to it?
Somewhat, yeah, in that so we talked about sort of Mount Fuji being thought of as sacred. It's comparable to a lot of sort of older religions in which see the sacred in the natural world. So like mountains are notable because, they're notable, so therefore they must be sacred. And I often, in fact, compare Shinto to like the Roman religion of, the Lares and the spirits of place. So predominantly Buddhist with other stuff going on, I guess, is the way to summarize. Other questions? Okay, let me take another sip of coffee. Okay, so this is the 20s in particular where this is happening and gets big. And so we have to ask, if curiosity killed the cat and the railroad kills the tanuki, what brings the tanuki back? And Foster suggests, and I think he's probably right, that for people in Japan and around the world, the wartime horrors of the 30s and 40s left people with no particular desire to go seeking out things that were monstrous, strange, and weird, because they could basically see them around them all the time. And in particular, sort of the devastation wrought by the end of the Pacific War in 1945 forced people in Japan to focus pretty resolutely, first on surviving day to day and then on the future. And it doesn't, in fact, seem to be a coincidence that Japan's first anime, Astro Boy, known in Japanese as Tetsuwan Atom, which was created by Tezuka Osamu, first as a manga in the late 50s, and then it was turned into an anime by his Mushi production studio in 1963. It doesn't seem to be a coincidence that it's about the adventures of a boy who's a robot. He's a robot in the shape of a boy, rather. And he lives in this near future Tokyo. And, you know, Adam is explicitly the most advanced robot of all. And it's hard to get more high-tech than that. And he, in fact, 1963 was only 1 year before the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, which Chris mentioned. This was when Japan sort of reintroduced itself to the world as a peaceful, up-and-coming economic power. And also, it was the year of the introduction of the so-called bullet train. So the Tokyo to Osaka line was the world's first high-speed rail system. And was and continues to be a technological marvel.
So what does being a robot have to do with escaping the devastation?
It's a symbol of like the technology and like the forward-thinking futurism.
But the robot still feels like
Yeah.
a human.
Yeah, Adam cries. I could spend an entire lecture talking about Astro Boy, but yeah, the point being, he definitely was wildly popular and was very science fictional. And Chris also mentioned again Japan's so-called economic miracle and then the bubble economy. These weren't without social, environmental, and political costs. And from sort of the 1960s onward, these became sort of more and more evident in society. And so along with that, Foster talks about how more and more people became nostalgic for the this theoretically simpler pre-modern, pre-industrial past. And this, you know, is explicitly characterized as being, you know, life in these rural communities that follow these traditions. And this lifestyle and those traditions had been abandoned in the quest for higher national GDP. So what you see in the 1970s and 80s is more and more sort of folklore, folk tales, folk ways popping up in popular culture, essentially, which here is essentially anime, manga, and movies. And in fact, this so-called yokai boom, as Foster describes it, and as people in Japan describe it, has become a mainstay of all of these media. So for Foster, he says, ironically, by fashioning folk tales within predominant modes of popular media, the very modernity that was going to cause the extinction of these tales and tropes allows them to flourish and to receive a wider distribution than ever before, which is certainly true. So one of the things I sort of want to highlight, or at least put up as a caution, is that anime and manga are both sort of these own distinct media, and they each have many genres of stories aimed at wildly divergent audiences of all age groups. So on some level, the whole concept of this lecture is kind of foolish. Attempting to put all of this in a box and saying, here's how it sorts out, doesn't really work very well. But I think we can sort of say a couple generic things about some anime and manga. So what we are going to have here is sort of a three-part grouping. So there's manga and anime that bring the elements of folk tales, fairy tales into contemporary Japan, and especially common are stories about tanuki and kitsune, fox spirits. We haven't talked much about foxes this week, but they're huge, and they've been huge in Japanese popular culture from essentially the beginning of the written record. There's tales about foxes shape-shifting. And especially since they're often women tempting men, there's definitely more than a few anime with cute fox girls going to high school, for instance. Do you have a question?
I'm just curious, why foxes?
Because they're tricksy. Yeah, I mean, the tanuki are often sort of seen as like the lovable, like in the tea kettle story, like the lovable good guy who can shapeshift. But foxes are often sometimes more hostile or sort of not nice, which makes sense in that, back in the day, foxes and people were competing for rice, essentially, and foxes were pests in the rice fields. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I've ever lived around foxes, but I have. They're pretty naturally crafty creatures. Like,
Yeah.
there are quite a few people that have cooped up their chickens, and that fox has managed to,
Yeah.
get in there and take the chickens. So it would make sense that kind of the personified version would be a trickster.
Yeah, they're super crafty in the stories. There's also a really famous kami called Inari, whose messenger is a fox. And Inari is originally the sort of god of fertility in the rice fields. And this eventually has become sort of just the god of success in business, so is wildly popular in Japan today. And Inari and the foxes are identified. One of the problems that the priests at the Fushimi Inari shrine in Kyoto have is like, no, Inari isn't a fox. No, really, Inari is not actually a fox, but it's a very sort of fine-grained distinction. So there's those which bring the folk tales into contemporary Japan. There's also a lot of anime and manga that sort of take what we might call these myths about traditional Japanese folklore and society and sort of set their stories in this sort of imagined past. And finally, there's also another strain of anime and manga that mash up Western fairy tales and folk tales with tropes of Japanese genres. And some of my favorite anime are in there. So we're going to look at examples of all of these. Yeah.
I apologize for not knowing this, but is there a distinction between anime and manga? Like, are these graphic styles?
It's a good question. So manga are drawn on the page on paper, and anime is on TV. It's essentially comics versus cartoons, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
the medium,
yeah.
and then the style, because it seems to be an identical style.
They share the same visual style, essentially.
Same
Yeah.
style. Okay.
And many anime and manga, many anime start out as manga, so they'll get popular in the magazines, and then they'll make them adapt them into a TV series, or a TV series will start really popular, and then they'll make a manga version, and increasingly, then they'll also make movies. Some manga or anime start out as web cartoons, video games. Many anime now are coming from original video games, so it's a media mix. Yeah.
So this is very specific, not that print, but if it's in a video game or just a still image online, what is it classified as?
Just video games.
Not anime or...
Right. Yeah. So anime is the TV or the animation in general. So also animated movies are known as anime, and then manga are the cartoons. Comics. Yeah.
What do people in Japan actually call the magazines when you're buying them, when you go into
Manga zashi.
manga zashi?
Yeah.
So they're not magazine or...
No, I've heard that word. It's more likely to be used for like glossy sort of magazines. Yeah, but so the manga zashi are like basically phone books every week, and they're printed or every month. And they're printed on like the cheapest possible paper. And so you'll find them sort of, you can in fact often find them sort of sitting in the subway, like people will read them and then leave them on the platform. But yeah, they're like this thick. And one manga magazine will have in its weekly issue one chapter from like, a dozen different series running. And so then those chapters are collected into individual volumes of each series and sold in bookshops. So, and you can buy the manga magazines at like any convenience store ever. So very widespread, very popular. Okay, one. So that was started out as a card game, Pokemon, and then they expanded it into video games. Actually, yeah.
A cartoon series.
Right, and then they made an anime, and there's also manga, and then there's more card games. So it's a virtuous cycle.
Japanese
Yeah, especially Pokemon, because like you can just keep adding new Pokemon. You collect them all. Yeah. So yeah, and Pokemon are a good example of sort of a wild media mix, because you can get Pokemon. I mean, they were on the JAL planes for a while. Pikachu was on the tail. And of course there's toys and figures and all this other stuff. My sister was big into Pokemon. I think we still have Pokemon Monopoly in the closet. I think that's had an anime, but it's never had a manga. That one's sort of different in that, you know, there's a huge ton of sort of character goods, but there's a deliberate attempt to not create too much story in order to not dull the appeal. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so so these first two types of stories, which are, you know, where the folktales are in the present, or there's the sort of idealized past of the folktale. And so Foster wants to say that this is about not only this modern persistence of mystery, but also a postmodern persistence of a desire for mystery. And he says that this is sort of like a fetishizing of an alternative space in which the imagination can expand, because the actual real world doesn't necessarily have that space. So instead of that alternative space being the future, which it is for science fiction, or this entirely fictional other world, which is fantasy, these ones share the Japan either in the past or in the present as that alternative space. So I mentioned Studio Ghibli at the start, and in fact they are sort of one of the most notable purveyors of this sort of story. So we talked about Mononoke Hime, which is set in this Japanese past. It's kind of medieval, it's kind of ancient. They talk about the amishi in there explicitly, but there's also gunsmithing going on. Great movie. Another less familiar Ghibli movie is Pom Poko, which is from 1994, and it tells the story of a clan of tanuki who are attempting to resist the urbanization of their woods. So they live on the edges of Tokyo, and they're trying to stop the development of their woods into a subdivision, essentially. So this should work.
Raccoons, on our way here, we witness the devastation that is occurring in your forest. We feel your pain. Call all the raccoons in the area. We will hold a meeting tonight to address this problem immediately.
Autumn, year 33 of the Pom Poko era. The masters had finally arrived. The raccoons gathered to greet them, their hope restored.
I am pleased to see such a fine moon out tonight. Fellow raccoons, I am Hage of Shikoku Island. In a few days, I will be 999 years old.
Raccoons! Why is Tama Hills ravaged by development while our island is nearly untouched? That's because we raccoons of Shikoku never stop haunting our forests and our mountains. Therefore, the humans on our island are well aware that disaster will befall them whenever they dare to enter our territory. In fact, Masters Kinsho, Hage, and myself are so good at frightening humans that various forms the three of us take are worshipped. in shrines and temples all over the island. My name is Gyobu, and I have led the raccoons of our island to peace and prosperity. I can lead you there as well.
Allow me to formally introduce myself as well. I am Kincho VI. In order to frighten every last human being out of Tower Hills, voila! We've decided to execute Operation Spectre, a plan which relies on our mastery of transformation. This plan requires extreme amounts of mental energy. So much energy, in fact, that any one of the three of us may not survive. But my fellow raccoons, we the masters of Shikoku are willing to take this risk. If we all combine our efforts and successfully carry out this plan, the humans will be so frightened, they will never set foot in Tama Hills again.
And then, once the human beings are fully primed with fear, we'll be able to stop their infernal development and destruction of the forests once and for all. Mark my words, we will prevail. We have brought you a boat that will swiftly ferry the raccoons of Tama Hills back to an era of greatness. Fellow raccoons, we promise you we are now in this boat together!
What a spectacular moon! There's nothing better than moonlight. Let us all bow our heads and pray to this gorgeous full moon that Operation Spectre will be safe, sound, and extremely successful.
Were they successful?
No. So in Japanese, and I wanted to rip the clip in Japanese, but I couldn't get the Japanese audio track to go on the clipping. I don't know why. So they staged this Operation Yokai, and they're attempting to frighten the human residents of this development into leaving off. And they take the forms of this night demon parade, Hayaki Yoko. But the plan fails because an amusement park executive goes on TV immediately afterward claiming that the entire spectacle is a PR stunt. So what happens in the end is that the tanuki and foxes who can shapeshift take up human form and join the rat race. And those who can't are relegated to the margins of human settlement. But in the final shot of the movie is all of them getting together and dancing under the moon on a golf course. So it's not as depressing as it could be. Excuse me. Yeah.
In 1994, that's when it first came out?
Mm-hmm.
Because it has real Star Wars, they look like the Ewoks and the
Yeah.
look like Yoda and dancing under the stars. Cross culture.
Exactly. Star Wars is huge in Japan. And one of the things I noticed while I was putting this together is the story is supposedly set in the 1960s, but there's very little in it that's actually explicitly datable. And in fact, so I like that clip because it starts from the train station and then they go through sort of the urban settlements out to the forest. And that cityscape still looks essentially the same. Japan today still looks basically like that. And in fact, in Japanese, the movie is called Heisei Tanuki Gassen, which is like Heisei Tanuki War. And the Heisei era didn't start until 1989. Even though it's ostensibly set in the 60s, it's basically about present Japan. And since Karen Wigan mentioned Tonari no Totoro, I thought I'd throw it in here because it's so iconic. And this is another Ghibli movie that's ostensibly set in the recent past, the 50s or 60s. So Tonari no Totoro, My Neighbor Totoro, I bet some of you could probably sing the song, is about a family that moves out to a farmhouse in the countryside. The mother is ill, so there's the father and 2 daughters in the house. And the daughters discover these strange, kindly creatures, Totoro, living in the countryside, and go on to befriend them. And this movie, I think, is notable since it seems to have filled a heretofore unrealized hole in Japanese national consciousness, because the Totoro are everywhere, absolutely everywhere. So here's sort of the most famous clip of the Totoro.
Totoro? Oh, wait a minute. Here, try this. Hurry! May's flipping. Hold it over your head, like this.
So that's Mei and Satsuki, the 2 girls, the sisters, and then the Totoro at the bus stop. And they're just all waiting for the bus, and it's totally normal.
Was the Totoro a new invention?
Yeah, but it looks like it could have stepped out of traditional pre-existing legends.
You know what's interesting is, one of the first clay figures that we saw in prehistoric, big round eyes, open round mouth, looked just like that kid almost.
Yeah.
Boy, the same.
Yeah, and Ghibli definitely draws on a lot of sort of older visual stuff. So the raccoons in Tanuki, rather, in Palm Poco, try to stage this Operation Yokai by reenacting what we can see here, which is a scene from a manga that I like called XXX Holic, which follows this high school student, Watanuki, that's him on the left, in his quest to rid himself of his ability to see spirits. So what happens is he goes to work for a so-called witch of dimensions, and she says that if he essentially agrees to be her houseboy, she will rid him of his ability to see spirits. But what happens along the way is that he actually gets better at seeing spirits and becomes sort of a master of magic and folklore. So early in the series, him and his friend Domeki, that's him on the right, encounter a Hyaki Yoko, and the demons actually talk about this. But they also are dealing with folk tales that were invented by the creators of the manga, Clamp, as well as stuff that is attested in earlier literature. So let's watch this one.
でもやだ。 妖怪が月夜に明かりを持って行進するってあの
江戸時代の画家のクレートがガスの百鬼夜ってこれどうするの？わからん。わからんのに偉そうだな、おい。
何をしているの？早く来ないと持ってかれるわよ。
この百鬼夜行からだ。
やっぱり百鬼夜行なんですか？
一年に一度こうやって行くんだ。
それ以外に何がってるの？
絵の世界とかじゃなくて。
そういう絵もあるね。ねえ、なんで絶対面白くないわよ。
私たちも遅れちゃうわ。
そうね、行きましょう。
If you look on the bottom right above the 06, you can see a tanuki who's half a tea kettle, as I noticed. And I also like this clip because the yokai in the parade are explicitly saying that they don't look like this image, which is from this Edo period artist, very famous, the Demon's One Night Parade. So, yeah. No, I think is the short answer. So to go on, for interest of time, Foster's article talks about this one manga creator in particular, Mizuki Shigeru, and he has gone on to create a ton of yokai-related material. Gegege no Kitaro, who's that kid in the B-striped vest in the middle right with one eye and the eyeball on top of his head, is wildly popular in Japan. And Mizuki himself also works as what he calls a yokai researcher. He's written a ton of encyclopedias of yokai, which feature both actual sort of traditional yokai and then a bunch of ones that he's made up. In fact, he's made up sort of so many yokai and published so many encyclopedias. Foster says that Mizuki's vision of Japan and its sort of yokai past, it's infested and it's more richer and more varied than ever existed in the cultural imaginary of pre-war or even pre-Meiji Japan. And so the top right is Shigeru is illustrating Yanagita's book, Tono Monogatari, in a manga version. The interesting thing, though, is that because, Shigeru portrays these pasts as being so yokai infested, is that people are, start to think of the past as actually being that yokai infested, even though the one and the other are not necessarily related. And in fact, Mizuki also sort of plays on this yokai infestation. This is one from his series, 53 Stations on the Yokai-do Road, which is a play on probably the most famous series of ukiyo-e prints ever, which was 53 Stations on the Tokaido Road, which is the road from Kyoto to Edo, which is now Tokyo. So that ukiyo-e series was, the 53 stations where processions had to stop and go through checkpoints, essentially. So this one is, the Yokai-do Road. And the little plinth says there are lots of monsters around here, as is obvious. So the museum has a couple images from later series capitalizing on the popularity of the first one. This is 53 famous places along the Tokaido Road. This is snow at Yamanaka Village. So you can see in the original Edo period drawing, there were not so many yokai. Whoops, wrong way. And this mixing of the elements of the old and new is not something that's limited to manga artists. This is one of my other favorites from the collection. This is an artist from Teraoka Masami criticizing the invasion of foreign chains into Japan. So the 31 flavors, that's Baskin Robbins. So using this very old visual idiom, this Edo-style drawing, style as well as materials to comment on current economic conditions.
That's because these creatures are all mushi. That's right. I suppose there's really no simple way to explain what they are. But let me give you an analogy. Say these four fingers represent animal life, and your thumb represents plant life. Human beings would be here, the tip of your middle finger, the farthest point from your heart. Moving toward the palm of your hand, you find the lower forms of animal life, When you get to your wrist, though, that's where your blood vessels combine into one, right?
Right.
This is where you would find fungi and microorganisms. From here, it becomes more and more difficult to distinguish between plant and animal life. Even so, there is still life beyond this point. And if you keep going, all the way up your arm, past your shoulder, when you get to this point, at the place that's closest to your heart, right here, these creatures are the Mushi. They are life in its purest form. Because of their nature, their shapes and physical appearances are ambiguous. Some you can see, some you can't.
Yeah, somewhat transparent. Sort of like a ghost.
Many of the things that people call ghosts are actually Mushi of some sort. Some can even take on human form.
So the wild popularity of Mizuki's works is such that he's had a huge amount of influence on later generations of manga and anime creators, and also in the way these tropes are depicted. So Gegege no Kitaro, who's this boy who lives in a graveyard, he's from a ghost family. He only has one eye, and his father, the spirit of his father takes the form of an eyeball that hangs out either on his shoulder or his head. But so the trope of this one-eyed boy who can see spirits, always missing the left eye, and in compensation, greater spiritual powers, it's made famous by Kitaro, and now it's basically totally normal for any sort of similar anime or manga. So Ginkgo, who is not this character, but the other dude, his hair is brushed over his face. That's because his other eye socket's empty. And Watanuki, who's the protagonist of the previous anime clip we watched, he eventually also loses his left eye and gains more power to see spirits. Ginkgo is from Mushishi, which is an anime and a manga created by Urashima Barayuki. He lost his eye when he was a boy, and Mushishi is really interesting. I mean, it's a great show, but it's also interesting since it's sort of straddling this ambiguous border between the early modern and the modern. Ginkgo wears Western clothes, but he's the only one, and he sort of wanders around this very traditional landscape, interacting. He's a mushi master, which is what mushishi means. And so he's helping the humans and mushi coexist, which is also what Kitaro does for humans and yokai. So there's one other clip about the mushi, if I can.
They dwell unseen in the shadows, a host of creatures completely different from the flora and fauna familiar to us, an invisible world of life within our own. Since the dawn of humanity, these phantoms have inspired fear in those who could not understand, and have over the ages come to be known as Mushi.
So as Ginkgo and the kid talk about, they're everywhere. Not everybody can see them, but they're everywhere. And this idea that this past Japan is overflowing with mysterious creatures and phenomena is very common. Okay, so hopefully this next part is going to work because I wasn't able to get the clip into the presentation. So the last, moving into the almost last part of this is anime and manga that sort of explicitly engage with and retell these fairy tales and tropes that are most familiar from the West. And this is a process that started when the country became open to international trade in the 1850s. And one sort of really good example of this type of story is Princess Tutu, which is an anime that's a fairy tale, and it goes something like this. Once upon a time in a faraway land, a handsome prince sacrificed his heart to seal away the evil ravens, but a kind-hearted duck was determined to save the prince, and because of the purity of her heart, she was granted the power to transform into a girl in a ballet academy, who in turn could transform into Princess Tutu. So hopefully this will work.
このお話を書いた人ってなんて人？ドロセルマイヤーの常識じゃん。そうなんだ。こんな本読んでニヤニヤしてる場合じゃないでしょ。アヒルには見たくないね。今日中にはできるようにしといてよ。頑張ってね。サボっちゃダメよ。さ、ドロセルマイヤーさんってこの町に住んでるの？ああ、大昔に住んでるの。お金が途中で終わってるのにね。そうそう。確か本書いてる途中で死んだんじゃない？
おう、彼はお話から出て、ヨガースを封じるために心臓を失った。
話を書いてた人が死んで、あのその中の人が出てきたってこと？そんな不思議なことって。あ、でもそんな人が人間になるよって不思議じゃないのかも。そっか。ミュート先輩はお話の中のお日様なのか。だからあんなに綺麗なんだ。ゆうちゃんは？
So that's a good sort of introduction to the concept. And if you heard the music in the background, that's the same music they played in Beauty and the Beast when the Rose story was being introduced. So if I could find my mouse, that would be great.
So is this based on an old story, or is it a new story pretending to be based on an old story?
This is a combination of, well, the mouse is on the other side now, is a combination of Swan Lake and other stuff. And it gets into, eventually the characters start resisting the storyteller, and it gets very meta, so they're battling for their own free will, essentially. It's pretty cool. And it's also, it's about ballet and girls saving the world. Okay, so... well, I did actually want to show another clip because this is what they call a magical girl show, Maho Shoujo. The most famous of these is undoubtedly Sailor Moon, but it's a super famous kind of anime and manga, and the most recognizable element is always the transformation sequence. So, hopefully... So that's Duck and her prince. Okay, so let me disconnect the projector again, and hopefully I can get the presentation back. One of these years, everything will work perfectly the first time. Yeah, seriously. Okay. Stop. So that's sort of the introduction to Revolutionary Girl Utena, which is one of my favorite anime series ever. It has this sort of very fairy tale style story going on, but what happens is that the main character, Utena, with the pink hair, she meets this prince as a child after her parents have died, and she's traumatized, and then he, tells her some stuff, and she decides she doesn't want to die. And so she decided to grow up to be a prince, because she was so impressed by the prince. And so she has this quest to become a prince, which she does by, at her private high school, joining a dueling club, fighting over the Rose Bride, who want the Rose Bride because she has the power to bring about the end of the world. In the finale of the movie, Utena turns into a race car. It's pretty great. Yeah. So this magical girl genre is, has these tropes, which is these unassuming schoolgirls who are transformed magically into heroes fighting for justice. And I think one of the things that's interesting coming out of these sorts of stories moves into the sort of very final portion of this talk, which is going to be brief. But so this idea that fairy tales keep being told and retold, and folk tales, folklore, and that they're part of this effort to develop maps for coping with, again, Maria Tatar, personal anxieties, family conflicts, social frictions, the myriad frustrations of everyday life. So these stories still have this ability to speak to us, provided that they're adapted and retold to suit the needs of the teller and the audience. So just as Western fairy tales and stories have entered Japanese popular consciousness, I could have given a whole other lecture on anime adaptations of the classics of Western literature. Some of the sort of most characteristic and popular elements of anime and manga have also started to enter global popular culture as stories and motifs to be reworked. So probably one of the first example of this was Godzilla, who in 1954 laid waste to Tokyo as a sort of a very explicit symbol of the devastation wrought by the nuclear bombing of Japan, and then also by continued environmental pollution from nuclear waste and nuclear material. So he usually is in Tokyo, but sometimes he comes and lays waste to New York as well. There was the early 2000s terrible adaptation with Matthew Broderick. I think they're making another one. Yeah, there was one where he came to San Francisco too. So there's also a very famous long-running genre of anime and manga. Oh no, stop it. Known as mecha anime, which are giant robots piloted by, usually by teenagers. So these giant robot fighting suits go into battle against one another, and sometimes also more unearthly threats. So this is a genre that dates in Japan back to, there was a manga in the 50s. The first one was most popular in 1972. And undoubtedly the most famous example is still Neon Genesis Evangelion, which was an anime from 1995 to 97. And then it was so popular, they went back and they're remaking a series of movies out of it, this time with a budget. So I'll show you the trailer for the first of the new movies, since it's probably the best summary of the series to date. Oh, Godzilla, go away. There we go.
We have a confirmed visual on the object. Lots are full of souls.
Middle of the way, direct hit. Bring the target down at all costs.
We're a clandestine organization that answers directly to the UN. The key in the effort to rebuild our home.
18 years ago, the second impact, half the world's population was wiped out. Now the angels have returned. There is little we can do to stop them. With limited options, we had to find a new solution to protect our way of life.
You're looking at the most advanced weapon system ever developed by man, the synthetic humanoid Evangelion. You will be the pilot.
There are others like you. Other children burdened with the task of protecting our home and saving mankind from the brink of extinction.
We are go for launch! Evangelion Unit 1, move out!
The Aves can read the angels. The fact that we're even here to see this means that mankind has a secret. I want you to understand that you're not the only one risking your life in this fight. We are all in this together.
The first one is almost literally a shot-for-shot remake of the first like 6 episodes of the anime, but the stories diverge later on. So both mecha and these sort of giant monsters or kaiju genres are very popular in Japan, and then particularly the monster movies have had a long life on late-night cable. Director Guillermo del Toro and his compatriots clearly enjoy both genres, as we'll see in the trailer to Pacific Rim.
We always thought alien life would come from the stars. But it came from deep beneath the Pacific. What the hell is going on? First kaiju made land in San Francisco. The second attack hit Manila. Then the third one hit Cabo. Then we learned this is not going to stop. In order to fight monsters, we created monsters of our own. We needed a new weapon. The Jaeger program was born. Pilots, our minds, our memories, connected. The man and machine become one. Today, at the edge of our hope, time. We chosen to believe in each other. Today we face the monsters that are outdoors. Today we are canceling the apocalypse. Pretty cool. Pacific Rim.
So that's where I'm going to end. Questions?
Pretty much the whole movie, just action scene after action scene.
It's a really good movie. I've actually seen it twice. I really like it, actually. As a mecha show, which it clearly is, it's actually pretty interesting because like one of the tropes of mecha anime is that like the pilots develop these horrible mental illnesses from the stress of piloting the suits. So what do they do in the Hollywood version? Well, they have 2 pilots to have the psychological burden. And so then people don't, become horribly depressed. So like that was an interesting innovation in the mecha genre. Like, well done, Guillermo del Toro. So it's cool, yeah.
We don't need to talk too much about it, but the thing that comes from under the sea, is it robotic or is it an animal?
They're kaiju. They're literally giant monsters like Godzilla and stuff.
Form. They're not
Yeah.
just Godzilla.
But in the movie, it becomes clear that they're actually genetically engineered weapons. So like the adversary who wants to colonize the Earth, because with acid rain and global warming, we've created the perfect conditions for their species here. They, instead of building robots, they build giant flesh monsters instead.
Oh, so this is actually being engineered from an outside
Yeah,
source.
yeah. So alternate dimensions, is the trope.
Did the alternate dimension come from the atomic blast?
No. This is like beyond this is beyond our universe, in parallel planes. But yeah, in keeping with the sort of current pop culture.
I'm just wondering, why do all these characters look so non-Japanese? Like they have Western eyes and they're blue-eyed.
In anime, in manga. So it's a two-part answer to that question, which is a pretty common one. The first part is that that's the standard way. So, well, I should clarify. Obviously, if people have pink hair or in Uchina, which is sort of set in these pseudo-European settings. If the anime are set clearly in not Japan, then they're meant to represent not Japanese people by and large. But shows that are set in Japan. So we saw. Let's see, Mushishi or Pompoko. That's actually the sort of standard visual idiom for Japanese people. That's pretty normal. Obviously, if someone has blonde hair and it's Japan, actual Japan, then they're probably dyeing their hair in anime and manga as well as in actual real Japan. So that's sort of normal, and to a Japanese audience, they don't look Western. That's just the visual idiom. But so that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that this also comes out of sort of empire and colonialism and racism. If you look at ukiyo-e prints and also the sort of newsprint, one sheet illustrated newsprints. So illustrated newspapers are a thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they were ukiyo-e prints done for those. To illustrate the events that were going on. So if you look around the time of the Sino-Japanese War or is it the Russo-Japanese War, in that sort of 10-year period from 1895 to 1905, the pigment that's used to represent Japanese people changes. So if you look at the ukiyo-e prints from sort of 1850s to sort of end of the 1800s, Japanese people are explicitly represented with this sort of pale yellow wash because there's Westerners showing up in ukiyo-e prints, and it's funny sometimes in the early ones they have little boxes identifying whether the Westerners are men or women because Western clothing and dress is totally unfamiliar, so they have to identify for people is that a dude or a lady, which is pretty funny to us because we're familiar with Western clothing obviously. But so it goes from being represented, Japanese people being represented by this sort of pale yellow wash to being represented with white or with just the background sort of pale paper. And this is explicitly part of Japan sort of trying to set itself apart from the rest of Asia, put itself in amongst the Western powers as not sort of a subject of, not as an object of colonization, but as a subject, a country that's going out and colonizing other people. So this visual convention, which flips then and has never gone back, is explicitly part of this international system that's based on sort of race and the civilizational hierarchy. So, two-part answer.
Maybe that could be kind of the same way Europeans depict Christ and the Virgin Mary with blonde hair, blue eyes.
Right. Yeah. So they're definitely partly.
Kind of that aesthetic of.
Yeah, and then also, in European cultures, for so long, especially in the Middle Ages, no one had ever left, their town, essentially, or maybe gone 10 miles out of it. So you're going to represent, your divine figure as looking like you. But for the people who sort of, resist the idea that, maybe Jesus actually looked like somebody who was born in modern day Middle East, that's definitely going on nowadays, so. Other sort of questions?
I was also going to say, I think it's interesting as far as the whole princess. It seems to start out the way we understand a princess and this, Princess Bride, flowers and it's all sweet. But then at one point, what I find is interesting is she she's turning into cars and
and fighting duels.
Fighting and stuff like that, which is interesting. So is that kind of, what about the society then as far as women? Are women, we're in a sense always very traditional, and then is that reflection of what's happening?
So this is sort of an interesting question. Like, one of the reasons I started watching anime, Utena was one of the first two that I watched, was because there did seem to be more agency for the female characters. And Utena in particular, I saw it in high school. It had girls with swords, and I was like, sweet, that's right up my alley. So there definitely is sort of more space for female characters to have agency, and there's also a lot more sort of female-centered stories that take concerns that aren't just like war and politics seriously, which and the denigration of sort of things that aren't about like big social issues has been pointed out by a number of feminist writers as one of the ways to suppress women's writing. When you say that these stories about feelings and emotions and interpersonal relations like aren't important, so there's that. The situation for like actual women in Japan is more complicated. Chris mentioned that the Constitution guarantees gender equality, but there's no enforcement arm to back it up. So we could think of, if there were no Civil Rights Bureau in the Department of Justice, would the civil rights situation look the way it actually does in the United States? Probably not. And there's explicit laws in the books mandating equity in pay for across genders, but again, the enforcement is very weak. There's a sort of still a strong social bias that women are going to be housewives, that they're not going to have careers, that if they do have a job, they're going to leave once they get married and get pregnant. That's still the ideology, but more and more young people in general and women in particular are sort of opting out and starting to say, this is too much. The expectations on me as the woman are like way too much. And this draws on sort of this long post-war history of economic development and sort of the social bargains that were made to foster economic growth. And now that the economic growth is essentially flat, people are saying, what is the point? And you also see, so young women are also sort of opting out of marriage and having children. Older women have also started to divorce their husbands a lot. I think 5 or 6 years ago, a law went through stipulating that in a divorce, a woman was entitled to half of the family property, family bank accounts, because like the bargain was essentially like the man would work outside the house and the woman would stay home and do everything else. But so the divorce law, now that it says women are entitled to half the money, many women have been divorcing their husbands because everybody in Japan is forced to retire by age 65 without exception, basically. And so the husband is at home for the first time in ever, basically, and he's a lump. And the woman's like, what am I doing? I have another 20, sometimes 30 years left in my life. I'm going to be slaving away for this dude, who can't feed himself. Screw this, I'm out. So they call it silver divorce.
They have California rules, which is 50-50.
Yeah, silver divorce. It's climbing.
So on that same token, women and in anime and manga, how many of these things are drawn or produced by women? All these stories?
That's another really good question. Many manga creators are female. Many of them. So like Clamp, who did XXX-Holic, which we watched, they're a group of 4 women. The creator of Mushishi, she's a woman. The creator of like what's probably my favorite recent anime and manga, Full Metal Alchemist, female.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, but so there's that, and there's probably gender equity, if not sort of more women in the manga industry than men. But there's basically no female animators in Japan. There's a few working in production, but like which is actually, pretty comparable to the American animation industry. The only Pixar film that was directed by a woman was Brave, and she was forced off the project halfway through. So, that's not uncommon. That's not unique to Japan, rather, but it's a definite thing. So.
This actually leads into my question. So I was reading in your article that the yokai and manga and anime kind of
hinted at this other reality and kind of infused people with the sense that there's this other world, there's something else. We have to question everything around us, and like it infused some hopefulness. So in current manga and anime, like you were saying, more women are doing this. Has it turned, or is it turning into more of a place for social commentary, like people that have not had voice before, like expressing hopes that we can see? It's not about another world, but it's kind of turning into something, like we have to question what we see too and envision it?
So there have been some anime and manga that have sort of explicitly commented on like contemporary Japan. There's one anime that I really like from a couple years ago called Eden of the East, which is explicitly about this group of post-college students. So they have degrees, but they can't find jobs because there aren't any jobs, which is not uncommon throughout the advanced industrial world at the moment. But is sort of a long-standing problem in Japan. As Chris mentioned, since 1991, the economy has basically been in the tank. And the anime, through this sort of far-fetched plot device, winds up sort of making the argument that like Japanese society should change to be able to incorporate the views and contributions of young people. Whereas in the media, and in particular the center-right party, the LDP, which just regained power, was out for a while, has characterized these jobless young people as like freeloaders, essentially, and that, you know, it's all their own fault that they have no jobs, whereas in fact the problems are mostly structural. So the anime is very much sort of talking back against that ideology. I think in general, though, since like the mid-70s, which is when sort of women started to be the ones drawing girls' comics and then also invented comics for women, definitely anime and manga have provided sort of a space for fantasy of alternate lives and alternate sort of social constructs. But like, you know, there's the fantasy, and then there's, you know, your actual real life, and whether the fantasy has affected real life much is debatable. Particularly, there's a whole sort of complex of things in women's manga that sort of is a way to get beyond like the very patriarchal conditions that most women live in. But like, I think, you know, it's not just for women that sort of find that also. I mean, it's not really a coincidence that probably a majority of anime and manga are high school stories. Because like for most Japanese people, high school is sort of the last time when you're sort of fully free. If you go into college is basically a 4-year vacation. But like that is sort of the latest in which you can escape sort of societal, familial obligations and pressures. So that's why there's so many anime set in high school. It's the time when people remember fondly.
So my students really love this stuff. I mean, they draw it, they feel like, sorry. So it's not something I particularly have liked. So if I were to start reading something, I'm really interested in I mean, I can see a lot of these things that you showed today that I think definitely some of the things around women. I think I've spoken to a lot of girls about that. But the boys are like totally into this too. So, I mean, what would you suggest?
I don't know. My favorite anime and manga is one called Full Metal Alchemist, which it's an action story set in like this pseudo-Edwardian like 1910s, 1920s sort of alternate society, and the conceit is that alchemy is a real thing, and that also that people can have sort of essentially robotic limbs. So the two protagonists are brothers, and their mother died when they were children, and they tried to bring her back using alchemy, which is the one big no-no in alchemy. So Edward, the older brother, lost his leg and his arm, and had them replaced with automail. And then the other brother, Alphonse, he lost his body, and his soul dwells inside a suit of armor. So, which is funny because even though he's the bigger one, he's the younger brother. Ed is really short, so Alphonse is like the suit of armor that's like 3 feet taller than him. And it's a really great manga. It's a really great anime. The story's really good. It has a lot of sort of thoughtful stuff. It resists a lot of the shonen cliches of like power up. and shows them going through sort of training and dealing with a lot of really complex moral stuff. So that one I think is sort of probably one that has the most, like, not the most, but has a good potential for cross-generational appeal. I don't know. I mean, like, my one cousin has been obsessed with Naruto for forever, and I can't stand Naruto personally, but like I have a ton of friends who like it. So, of like my age or older or also younger. So it's partly a function of like genre expectations. I think most of my friends and I who like anime and manga are also really into like sci-fi and fantasy. And many sort of anime and manga narratives are sort of science fictional or fantastical. So I think if you like that sort of thing, you're more likely to like most anime. But I don't know, I guess the other one, Sailor Moon.
Full Metal what?
Alchemist. Alchemist, yeah. Sailor Moon is a classic. They've been re-releasing the manga in English recently. That's about 5 schoolgirls with powers. Yeah, it's really great. I don't know what else is recent that's good, but yeah.
So I'm not too familiar with comic and graphic novel culture here in the U.S., but how does it compare, how does manga compare with, say, that culture here? My sense, just from superficial reading, is that there's kind of graphic novels sort of political here, like kind of a leftist bent to it. Is that true in Japan also, or when you look at the vast range of manga and graphic novels and cartoons, how does it compare culturally?
I think the biggest thing is that like manga is sort of way more popular across the board in Japan. Like whereas here, graphic novels have started to gain a lot of like literary prestige, but like superhero comics are still sort of like, oh, why do you want to read that trash? And DC and Marvel have like many problems with distribution and representation, and there's a whole other host of things going on. Whereas in Japan, the idea that manga have literary and artistic merit is like totally normal. I mean, there's some that are total schlock, and there's some that are really great. As usual, the rule that 90% of everything is crap holds pretty globally, I think. But so, actually, to answer your question about like political orientations, the first time I went to Japan on my Fulbright, I was actually studying hyper-nationalist manga, which this really sort of violent, right-wing, racist stuff that was being put out. It's like popular in like the mid-2000s. Since then has sort of not been very popular. But so manga is definitely a vehicle for any kind of political sentiments. Yeah, whereas here I think, I don't know about political orientations in graphic novels. The thing that's interesting is that like, whereas the US has like a relatively popular, thriving indie comics scene. So people here have probably heard of Gene Yang. He wrote American Born Chinese. He's doing the Avatar comic adaptations. He came out of the indie comics scene. In Japan, the indie comic scene is like microscopic. And the most famous magazine for indie comics like never was able to actually even pay its creators. You know, it was just like, be featured for exposure. So, because manga is so popular there, and there's many companies, so there's not really a space for an indie comic scene because they do have such a breadth of subject matter.
I think leading to that, there's a lot of autobiographical comics in the U.S. Is there anything like that in Japan at all?
God, what is in the bottom of this coffee? So I think the most popular one, there's some of that. Mizuki Shigeru has released a memoir. I don't know if it was in manga or not, but there's one of the most famous alternative comics artists in Japan has a manga autobiography memoir. It's called Manga Horyu, I believe, which is a drifting life, and it's been released here in English by the Fancy Press, Drawn and Quarterly. Yoshihiro Tatsumi is his name. So that's probably the most famous sort of manga memoir. And it's cool because like he met Tezuka when he was a kid, and so he like draws Tezuka and like the Tezuka style and stuff. So yeah, that one's definitely the most famous. Yeah.
Just in response to your question, does anybody here use the four immigrants manga in your teaching?
The four
immigrants manga. I can go. I think we have a copy in our library in our bookstore. I'll go get it. It's about. It's a manga written about the Japanese experience in San Francisco from the early 20th century.
Yeah. Fred Schott found it in the Berkeley Library archives and published it. And it was basically, it was unknown in Japan and like had been printed like once here, but yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, it was by this Issei guy who,
Was he interned?
no, he was sent back, he went back. Yeah, his family still lives in Japan, so, yeah. Yeah.
I have another question.
Okay.
Neil Gaiman, a British writer.
Neil Gaiman, yeah.
Yeah. He wrote Graveyard Boy.
Yeah.
We talked about that. I wondered if that because my kids love that book. But
I like that book too.
Yeah, but I was so startled. I mean, I read the book, but when you mentioned about the graveyard, I thought, oh, did he get the idea? Sometimes, you know,
I don't know.
culture thing.
Yeah, possible. I don't know. Neil Gaiman often irritates me, but I definitely like that book.
Yeah.
So,
That was good.
yeah. And The Sandman is like a landmark of comics. So, yeah.
Okay, so taking this kind of back to the whole folktale thing, do children in Japan have folktales told to them the way sometimes here it happens, like, well, in school, you know, let's read these folktales. Like, do they ever just straight up do it as, let's study folktales?
I don't know. I think probably like as part of like kanji practice and stuff, like stories like Momotaro and stuff are still told. And I mean like, and they're just sort of in like writing characters.
Oh, okay.
You have to learn to do that. It's complicated. That's a lot of elementary education is learning kanji. So yeah, and like it's just like it's in sort of the cultural ethos, you know, like you'll go by billboards and they'll be like, you know, drawing on Momotaro in some way or something, you know.
That's kind of here too.
Yeah.
There is explicit instruction, like a lot of children's books here are fables or, you know, always.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, Japan
it's hard
too.
to grow up here and not know Little Red Riding Hood or know
Yeah.
Cinderella. I mean.
Yeah, definitely. So that's sort of very comparable.
In that, not as manga, but as like, here's a book. Okay.
Yeah, that too. There's definitely picture books and stuff. So, okay, I think, do we need to take a break now?
We have time for a couple more questions if we've got one.
Okay, I don't remember the schedule, so.
Are there any early historical precedents for Revolutionary Girl? Any kind of tales of women stepping outside their...
Well, so you can sort of find women behaving badly in every historical era. The actual more immediate precedent is this manga called Rose of Versailles from the 70s, which the anime has been subtitled and released professionally here. The manga is still not available, has still not been licensed, so you can get it online in scanlations. But so Rose of Versailles is this story set at the end of Ancien Regime France. And so the main character is a girl who was raised as a boy by her father. Her name is Oscar de Jarges, and she grows up to be the captain of Marie Antoinette's personal guard. And so she wears men's clothes. And the manga is the manga is amazing. The anime is good too. And it was a milestone of girls' comics. You know, girls sort of wanted to be Oscar or they wanted to date Oscar or both. Oscar winds up sort of having to choose between two men, two love interests. One's this foppish aristocrat who's a jerk and the other one is like her childhood best friend. So And when the childhood best friend died, a couple of people famously sent the mangaka razor blades because they were so upset. So then it became an anime, and it was also adapted into a musical by the all-female theater troupe, Takarazuka, which is famous for its gender-bending portrayals of men and women, and they've been going since the 20s.
And farther back, the traditional folk tales of Japan, nothing.
I don't know. I don't know any, but like, that doesn't mean they don't exist. It's not like China where I could say like, oh, Mulan maybe. But yeah, so like Rose of Versailles, Utena is very definitely in this like anime manga family tree that starts with Rose of Versailles. And there's a couple sort of intervening things. And in fact, Utena, the creator of that, did the anime for Sailor Moon. It was the anime he did after Sailor Moon. And people thought it was going to be a very family-friendly show, and then the second half gets into like some stuff that is not family-friendly. So they were like, oh no, and had to stop their children watching it. So, yeah. There's a terrible movie adaptation of Rose of Versailles, like a live-action one that was done in Britain in like the 80s, but it's bad. It was terribly directed. The actress playing Oscar is terrible. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing our old stories into the
Thank you.